Hey everyone, welcome back, or for your first time. My name's Christian, this is Shoosha, and today we are going to be reading part 2 of Joseph Conrad's masterpiece, Heart of Darkness. If you didn't see part 1, you can go watch it, that'd be great, but also I'm going to do a recap in just a second of everything you missed, so if you want, you can just start with this video, that's fine. Really quick before I even get into that though, I got this interesting comment that kind of prompted the question, what were the common attitudes about race at the time when Heart of Darkness was published in 1899, particularly among white people in Europe and America, which would have been Conrad's audience, certainly the majority of it. And so I think it's worth exploring that for just a few minutes. There's this really famous poem written by Rudyard Kipling that you might have already heard of. It's called The White Man's Burden. It was published the same year as this novella, and it really kind of encapsulates the attitude that this novella is wrestling with, and I think this novella is really kind of ultimately arguing against. The attitude is one of kind of this sacred obligation that European and European descended nations at the time had to spread civilization. And in 1899, Kipling wrote, as a British writer, kind of writing to the United States of America and talking about the prospect of our taking over the Philippines and treating it as a colony. He wrote, "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." So this kind of really patronizing and dehumanizing attitude towards people that would be subjugated by other nations, that would be colonized by other nations, is really neatly captured in this poem by Kipling. And it is worth noting that not everyone shared this opinion, or this viewpoint, this attitude. Mark Twain famously was a fan of Kipling's in general, but he really hated this poem and said that if the United States kind of takes his advice and invades the Philippines because we think it's the white man's burden to civilize them, Mark Twain said that if we do that, we should change the colors of the flag from red, white, and blue to just black and white. And we should replace the stars on our flag with a skull and crossbones. So Mark Twain was a really notable exception to this attitude. And there were other people at the time who saw severe moral problems with this way of thinking. But what did the United States do? We invaded the Philippines. And what did the Belgians do in the Congo when Joseph Conrad was there, when his character Marlow was there? We're about to find out as we travel deeper into the Congo, deeper into colonialism with part 2 of Heart of Darkness. Now, what was part 1 about? Well, technically, the story in its entirety is this. There are 5 dudes on a boat. Only one of them has a name. His name is Marlow, and he is telling a story. The actual narrator of the book doesn't have a name. And so everything that we get from Marlow, which is definitely the meat of the story, it all actually comes in quotation marks. One paragraph after another starts with a quotation mark because it's the narrator saying what Marlow said while these 5 men were on a boat sailing out from London. But of course, the real story is Marlow's, and what he relates in part 1 is that he was a sailor, but he was out of a job. And as a boy, he had always been fascinated by Africa as this like blank space on a map, unexplored. And by the time he was a grown man and working as a sailor, it was no longer a blank space on the map, but he still wanted to go there. He wanted to explore. And so he reached out to his family relations. He was really embarrassed about it. "I am sorry to own I began to worry them," he says. So he reaches out to his family connections to try and get essentially an interview with a company that's operating in the Congo. And sure enough, he gets the interview and really the job offer. And as a part of that, he has to see a doctor to kind of check off his physical health before he gets sent by this Belgian company to the Belgian colonized Congo. And the doctor asks him, "Ever any madness in your family?" And the doctor sort of continues asking these questions that clearly annoy Marlow and kind of point to the fact of like, why are you going there? Like, you are clearly unwell. Because the guy that Marlow's going to replace is the captain of a steamboat who was murdered by locals after he attacked locals. So it's just like clearly a terrible idea for anyone to go here. And yet Marlow's doing it because he's unemployed and wants an adventure. I think it's his aunt who helped him get the job, on the other hand, has this white man's burden attitude about the whole thing, and she thinks that he was something like an emissary of light, something like a lower sort of apostle. And so we ended with Marlow having secured this position. Now he's going to go, like, actually start his journey and go to the Belgian Congo. That's where we left off last time, and that's where we begin this time. "I left in a French steamer," Marlow says, "and she called in every blamed port they have out there for, as far as I could see, the sole purpose of landing soldiers and custom house officers. I watched the coast." He's talking about the coast of Africa already. "Watching a coast as it slips by the ship is like thinking about an enigma. There it is before you, smiling, frowning, inviting, grand, mean, insipid, or savage, and always mute with an air of whispering. Come and find out. This one was almost featureless, as if still in the making, with an aspect of monotonous grimness. The edge of a colossal jungle, so dark green as to be almost black, fringed with white surf, ran straight like a ruled line far, far along a blue sea whose glitter was blurred by a creeping mist. The sun was fierce. The land seemed to glisten and drip with steam. Here and there grayish-whitish specks showed up, clustered inside the white surf, with a flag flying above them, perhaps. Settlements, this is what he's seeing. Settlements some centuries old and still no bigger than pinheads on the untouched expanse of their background. We pounded along, stopped, landed soldiers, went on, landed custom house clerks to levy toll in what looked like a god-forsaken wilderness with a tin shed and a flagpole lost in it, landed more soldiers to take care of the custom house clerks, presumably. So he's on this boat, and they're taking soldiers and these clerks, these, like, pencil pushers, who are kind of the key workers in these European colonies that are sprouting up all over Africa. Some, I heard, got drowned in the surf, but whether they did or not, nobody seemed particularly to care. They were just flung out there, and on we went. Every day the coast looked the same, as though we had not moved, but we passed various places, trading places, with names like Grand Passam, Little Popo. These are cities in the Ivory Coast and Congo. Names that seemed to belong to some sordid farce acted in front of a sinister backcloth. The idleness of a passenger, my isolation amongst all these men with whom I had no point of contact, the oily and languid sea, the uniform somberness of the coast, seemed to keep me away from the truth of things, within the toils of a mournful and senseless delusion. And this idea that he's kept away from the truth of things is only going to deepen and twist and turn in his mind until there's nothing else left. The voice of the surf heard now and then was a positive pleasure, like the speech of a brother. It was something natural that had its reason, that had a meaning. Now and then a boat from the shore gave one a momentary contact with reality. It was paddled by black fellows. You could see from afar the white of their eyeballs glistening. They shouted, sang. Their bodies streamed with perspiration. They had faces like grotesque masks, these chaps, but they had bone, muscle, a wild vitality, an intense energy of movement, that was as natural and true as the surf along their coast. There's a movie my wife and I watched a few years ago. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but there's this scene where parents are showing up for an adoption, or they're showing up to learn about adoption. And it's kind of this joke in the scene that one of the parents is really obviously there. She keeps talking about The Blind Side and how, like, she's clearly just this woman with an appetite for adopting a young, talented, athletic black kid who can grow up to live the life of the dude from The Blind Side. And it's interesting because I'm reminded of that just kind of joke in this scene. I think the movie has Mark Wahlberg in it, and it's like about adoption. But the reason that scene comes to mind is because you can hear in Marlow's voice more than 100 years ago, kind of the same voice that you hear in people like that who want to like have the story of The Blind Side for themselves as the parents who adopt the talented, athletic young black kid. Marlow says, they had bone, muscle, a wild vitality, an intense energy of movement. Continues on, an energy of movement that was as natural and true as the surf along their coast. They wanted no excuse for being there. They were a great comfort to look at. For a time, I would feel I belonged still to a world of straightforward facts, but the feeling would not last long. Something would turn up to scare it away. We'll come back to that in a minute. Once I remember we came upon a man of war anchored off the coast. There wasn't even a shed there, and she was shelling the bush. It appears the French had one of their wars going on thereabouts. Her ensign drooped limp like a rag. The muzzles of the long 8-inch guns stuck out all over the low hull. The greasy, shiny swell swung her up lazily and let her down, swaying her thin masts. In the empty immensity of earth, sky, and water, there she was, incomprehensible, firing into a continent. Pop would go one of the 8-inch guns. A small flame would dart and vanish. A little white smoke would disappear. A tiny projectile would give a feeble screech. And nothing happened. Nothing could happen. There was a touch of insanity in the proceeding, a sense of lugubrious drollery in the sight. Lugubrious meaning kind of melodramatically mournful, and drollery basically meaning kind of like a joke. So it's like there was something, an Eeyore-like joke about the whole thing, a sort of absurdly sad joke going on with this ship just shooting cannonballs aimlessly into a continent. And it was not dissipated by somebody on board assuring me earnestly there was a camp of natives, he called them enemies, hidden out of sight somewhere. We gave her her letters, so the ship that Marlow's on gives letters written to the sailors on this other ship that's pointlessly shooting at the shore. I heard the men in that lonely ship were dying of a fever at the rate of 3 a day. And we went on. We called at some more places with farcical names, where the merry dance of death and trade goes on in a still and earthy atmosphere as of an overheated catacomb. All along the formless coast, bordered by dangerous surf, as if nature herself had tried to ward off intruders. In and out of rivers, streams of death and life, whose banks were rotting into mud, whose waters, thickening into slime, invaded the contorted mangroves that seemed to writhe at us in the extremity of an impotent despair. Nowhere did we stop long enough to get a particularized impression, but the general sense of vague and oppressive wonder grew upon me. It was like a weary pilgrimage amongst hints for nightmares. It was upwards of 30 days before I saw the mouth of the big river, the Congo. We anchored off the seat of the government. It's a city called Boma, the capital at the time. But my work would not begin till some 200 miles further on. So as soon as I could, I made a start for a place 30 miles higher up. So Marlow has taken a boat from Europe all the way down the African coast toward the capital of the Congo. But rather than stay there for very long at all, he makes a start for a place 30 miles higher up. And how does he do that? I had my passage on a little sea-going steamer. Her captain was a Swede, and knowing me for a seaman, invited me on the bridge. He was a young man, lean, fair, and morose, with lanky hair and a shuffling gait. As we left the miserable little wharf, he tossed his head contemptuously at the shore. "Been living there?" he asked. I said, "Yes." "Fine lot, these government chaps, are they not?" he went on, speaking English with great precision and considerable bitterness. "It is funny what some people will do for a few francs a month." Isn't that so true? It's funny what some people will do for a few dollars a month, a few francs a month. I wonder what becomes of that kind when it goes up country. And that's Marlow. He's willing to do anything for a few francs a month, and he's about to go up country. I told him I expected to see that soon. "So," he exclaimed. He shuffled athwart, keeping one eye ahead vigilantly. "Don't be too sure," he continued. "The other day I took up a man who hanged himself on the road." He was a Swede, too. "Hanged himself? Why in God's name?" I cried. He kept on looking out watchfully. Who knows? The sun too much for him. Or the country, perhaps. At last we opened a reach. A rocky cliff appeared, mounds of turned-up earth by the shore, houses on a hill, others with iron roofs, amongst a waste of excavations or hanging to the declivity. A continuous noise of rapids above hovered over this scene of inhabited devastation. A lot of people, mostly black and naked, moved about like ants. A jetty projected into the river. A blinding sunlight drowned all this at times in a sudden recrudescence of glare. "There's your company's station," said the Swede, pointing to the 3 wooden barrack-like structures hanging on the rocky slope. "I will send your things up. 4 boxes, did you say? So, farewell." I came upon a boiler wallowing in the grass, then found a path leading up the hill. He's talking about a boiler that should be on a ship to power the ship, essentially like the engine of a steamboat. And there it is, wallowing in the grass. He's on a path which turned aside for the boulders, and also for an undersized railway truck lying there on its back with its wheels in the air. One was off. The thing looked as dead as the carcass of some animal. I came upon more pieces of decaying machinery, a stack of rusty rails. Do you have any neighbors like this? People who just have like refrigerators and rotted out cars in their front lawn? We have 1 or 2. To the left, a clump of trees made a thick shade where dark things seemed to stir feebly. I blinked. The path was steep. A horn tooted to the right, and I saw the black people run. Okay, really quickly, I just want to flag here. For the next 2, 3, 4 pages, which is about as far as we're going to go today. Actually, we'll go a bit further, but for the next 4 pages, it's interesting to note how often you hear the words white and black, and how much Conrad pays attention to these colors here. And you might, be tempted to think like, okay, literature guy, are you just making too much of, are you just, making up word games where they don't actually make sense? But does Conrad pay this much attention to any other color? Does he even mention another color? So it's interesting. Keep an ear out for how often you hear the words black and white. A horn tooted to the right, and I saw the black people run. A heavy and dull detonation shook the ground. A puff of smoke came out of the cliff, and that was all. No change appeared on the face of the rock. They were building a railway. The cliff was not in the way of anything, but this objectless blasting was all the work going on. A slight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up the path. They walked erect and low and slow, balancing small baskets full of earth on their heads, and the clink kept time with their footsteps. Black rags were wound round their loins, and the short ends behind wagged to and fro like tails. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope, Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected together with a chain whose bights swung between them, rhythmically clinking. Another report from the cliff made me think suddenly of that ship of war I had seen firing into the continent. So just like that French ship had been pointlessly bombarding the shore of Africa, he's watching them pointlessly, this objectless blasting of this cliff that isn't even in the way of the railroad that they're building. It was the same kind of ominous voice, but these men could by no stretch of imagination be called enemies. They were called criminals, and the outraged law, like the bursting shells, had come to find them, an insoluble mystery from over the sea. All the meager breasts panted together. The violently dilated nostrils quivered, the eyes stared stonily uphill. They passed me within 6 inches, without a glance, with that complete, death-like indifference of unhappy savages. Behind this raw matter, one of the reclaimed, the product of the new forces at work, strolled despondently, carrying a rifle by its middle. So there's this chain of 6 black men heavily advancing uphill, and then there's one black man who he's called one of the reclaimed. I think it's pretty clear he's being sarcastic here. The product of the new forces at work. He had a uniform jacket with one button off, and seeing a white man, Marlow, on the path, hoisted his weapon onto his shoulder with alacrity. So it's like this 10 hut moment, like, attention. This was simple prudence, white men being so much alike at a distance, that he could not tell who I might be. He was speedily reassured, and with a large, white, rascally grin, and a glance at his charge, seemed to take me into partnership in his exalted trust. After all, I also was a part of the great cause of these high and just proceedings. Again, some more sarcasm. Instead of going up, I turned and descended to the left. My idea was to let that chain gang get out of sight before I climbed the hill. You know I am not particularly tender. I've had to strike and to fend off. I've had to resist and to attack sometimes. That's only one way of resisting, without counting the exact cost according to the demands of such sort of life as I had blundered into. So Marlow's saying he knows these mean streets, and he's not soft-hearted. I've seen the devil of violence and the devil of greed and the devil of hot desire. But by all the stars, these were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men, I tell you. But as I stood on this hillside, I foresaw that in the blinding sunshine of that land I would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly. How insidious he could be, too, I was only to find out several months later and 1,000 miles further. For a moment I stood appalled, as though by a warning. Finally, I descended the hill, obliquely, towards the trees I had seen. So this is important to kind of dive into for a second, bite into for a second, because what Marlow's saying is that he's seen the world. He's seen the ugly sides. He's seen the devil of violence, of greed, of hot desire. But he thinks these are sort of manly devils, that they sway and drove men, I tell you. I foresaw that in the blinding sunshine I would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious, that is, given to rape, and pitiless folly. Folly, we've all probably heard this word, but I looked into it a little bit just because it's so important here. And it's not just like a mistake. It's a confident, it's a foolishness that's committed with confidence, and a foolishness that's committed with confidence at a great cost. A really costly and arrogantly executed stupidity. And that, I think, is the something that Marlow was referring to a few pages back when he says, "For a time I would feel I belonged still to a world of straightforward facts, but the feeling would not last long. Something, a rapacious and pitiless folly, would turn up to scare it away," where he sees the steamer, essentially the engine of a steamship, just like lying there on the grass. And then he sees a railway car turned upside down, so its wheels are up in the air. He sees them blasting a cliff when they're building a railroad, but the cliff isn't even in the way of the railroad. And he's seen this ship just pointlessly bombarding the coast of Africa. It's just all this folly. And the great cost of that folly is outlined by that chain gang that he saw going by. And it's about to be he's about to paint a much deeper picture of the cost of that folly. I avoided a vast artificial hole somebody had been digging on the slope, the purpose of which I found it impossible to divine. It wasn't a quarry or a sandpit anyhow, it was just a hole. It might have been connected, some more sarcasm, with the philanthropic desire of giving the criminals something to do. I don't know. Then I nearly fell into a very narrow ravine, almost no more than a scar in the hillside. I discovered that a lot of imported drainage pipes for the settlement had been tumbled in there. There wasn't one that was not broken. It was a wanton smash-up. At last I got under the trees. My purpose was to stroll into the shade for a moment, but no sooner within than it seemed to me that I had stepped into the gloomy circle of some inferno. The rapids were near, and an uninterrupted, uniform, headlong, rushing noise filled the mournful stillness of the grove, where not a breath stirred, not a leaf moved, with a mysterious sound, as though the tearing pace of the launched earth had suddenly become audible. So Marlow's walked far enough into this bizarre outpost, and he's now by this river that's really loud, and you can't really hear anything, and he's in the shade of some trees. And here, again, is the cost of that rapacious and pitiless folly. Black shapes crouched, lay, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth, half coming out, half effaced within the dim light in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. Another mine on the cliff went off, followed by a slight shudder of the soil under my feet. The work was going on, the work, and this was the place where some of the helpers had withdrawn to die. They were dying slowly, it was very clear. They were not enemies, they were not criminals, they were nothing earthly now, nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation, lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. Brought from all the recesses of the coast in all the legality of time contracts, lost in uncongenial surroundings, fed on unfamiliar food, they sickened, became inefficient, and were then allowed to crawl away and rest. These moribund shapes, moribund meaning bound for death, these moribund shapes were free as air and nearly as thin. I began to distinguish the gleam of eyes under the trees. Then, glancing down, I saw a face near my hand, the black bones reclined at full length with one shoulder against the tree, and slowly the eyelids rose and the sunken eyes looked up at me, enormous and vacant, a kind of blind white flicker in the depths of the orbs, which died out slowly. The man seemed young, almost a boy, but with them it's hard to tell. I found nothing else to do but to offer him one of my good Swede's ship's biscuits I had in my pocket. So a cookie he got from the Swedish guy who took him on his ship to this outpost. The fingers of this dying man or boy closed slowly on it, the biscuit, and held. There was no other movement and no other glance. He had tied a bit of white worsted round his neck. It's like a bit of yarn or string. Why? Where did he get it? Was it a badge, an ornament, a charm, a propitiatory act? That is, an act to appease an angry god. Was there any idea all connected with it? It looked startling round his black neck, this bit of white thread from beyond the seas. Near the same tree, 2 more bundles of acute angles sat with their legs drawn up. One, with his chin propped on his knees, stared at nothing in an intolerable and appalling manner. His brother phantom rested its forehead as if overcome with a great weariness, and all about others were scattered in every pose of contorted collapse, as in some picture of a massacre or a pestilence. While I stood horror-struck, one of these creatures rose to his hands and knees and went off on all fours towards the river to drink. He lapped out of his hand, then sat up in the sunlight, crossing his shins in front of him, and after a time let his woolly head fall on his breastbone. I didn't want any more loitering in the shade, and I made haste towards the station. When near the buildings I met a white man in such an unexpected elegance of get-up that in the first moment I took him for a sort of vision. I saw a high starched collar, white cuffs, a light alpaca jacket, snowy trousers, a clear silk necktie, and varnished boots. No hat. Hair parted, brushed, oiled under a green-lined parasol held in a big white hand. He was amazing, and had a pen holder behind his ear. Okay, there's a lot to unpack here. I think this video has already been going on for a while, so I'm going to try and do it relatively quickly. Although, you know what? The point of these videos, for me at least, is to take my time to enjoy great literature. So, never mind. I'm not going to do it quickly. Anyway, the whole black and white thing that I was pointing out. Conrad does mention one other color, doesn't he? He mentions green twice. We get the green of, I think it's like the grass or the trees or something. And we also get that just now that something was green that the accountant has. Snowy and varnished boots under a green-lined parasol. Yeah. So he does mention the color green twice in this last passage. Did you count by chance how many times he mentioned black or white? I counted myself just today going through this text earlier, and I got 7 counts of black and 9 counts of white. That's a lot. That's a lot, and clearly much more than any other color, and most colors aren't even mentioned. So there's something going on here is my point, and the numbers reflect that there's something going on here. What is going on here? Well, that's up for debate, but let me give you my reading. Marlow is kind of obsessed with deciphering what's true and what's false about the white man's burden view on race in his age. Because he's there at the front of it. He's bearing the white man's burden. He's colonizing the Congo on behalf of powerful interests in Belgium. And how's that going? Well, there's an upturned train car. There's a ship that's just bombarding the coast pointlessly. There's a railroad that's technically being developed, but they're lighting off dynamite in the wrong places for the railroad. And there are black men who are reduced to, in Marlow's words, black shapes, creatures. At one point he has this really interesting phrasing where he says something like a collection of angles or something like that. And you know, you could say that maybe his language there is kind of disrespectful and dehumanizing, but I think it's kind of impressionistic and just acknowledging that, like, the conditions that these natives have been subjected to are such that it has stripped them of their humanity, at least in appearance, you know, even if that might not be true in some deep sense, like they've just been treated like animals and they've been left to die like animals. And it's horrific and it's hideous. But it's not just that simple either. We're about to see with the accountant how kind of suddenly the image of the white man bringing order to savage nations has this kind of, for Marlow at least, undeniable lingering resonance and power over him at least. And I think we still see this today. And I'm not here personally to try to deliver my judgment on what was happening in the Congo then or what's happening in other countries today, but I am fascinated by what the text has to say about it. And so let's continue on. Let's hear what he has to say about the accountant. But I did just want to highlight one last really interesting thing here, which is, Marlow writes, actually, sorry, two more things to cover here. First of all, Marlow writes that when there's this dying black man, who he curiously does call a man, even though the others are shapes and creatures, but he calls this person a man, when he's reaching up to take this bit of food that Marlow's offering him, he says, the man seemed young, almost a boy, but with them it's hard to tell. And so you might hear that and think like, well, that sounds sort of racist, and yet something that's really interesting is 2 pages before that, he's kind of imagining the perspective of this black man who's now carrying a gun and guarding the chain gang of other black men who have been kind of trapped into this operation. And he says that from the perspective of that black guard, he had a uniform jacket with one button off, and seeing a white man on the path, hoisted his weapon. This was simple prudence, white men being so much alike at a distance. So Marlow here is really careful to he has his own kind of snap judgments that you can't tell these African people apart, whether they're men or boys. And yet he also can understand that from their perspective, they'd have a hard time telling him apart. And so I think that level of empathy for the populations that are being brutalized here is really striking. And then this moment is just so, it's just so poignant. It's so, I don't know, great and terrible in its way, where there's this dying man who reaches up to take the biscuit, and he says he had tied a bit of white worsted round his neck. Why? Where did he get it? Was it a badge, an ornament, a charm, a propitiatory act? Was there any idea at all connected with it? It looked startling round his black neck, this bit of white thread from beyond the seas. If you've stayed here long enough, tell me in the comment section what you think about that. What does that communicate? What is Marlow's philosophy that he's conveying to us? I'll leave it open. Okay, we are almost to the end of part 2. Let's keep going. So Marlow's terrified at what he's seen, and he runs away. Basically, he's like, God, get me out of here. This place is terrifying. And he runs into the accountant, who has a high starched collar, white cuffs, a light alpaca jacket. It goes on, and Marlow says, I shook hands with this miracle, and I learned he was the company's chief accountant, and that all the bookkeeping was done at this station. He had come out for a moment, he said, to get a breath of fresh air. The expression sounded wonderfully odd with its suggestion of sedentary desk life. I wouldn't have mentioned this fellow to you at all, only it was from his lips that I first heard the name of the man who is so indissolubly connected with the memories of that time. I don't think that's quite true, and Marlow's going to tell us why that's not true, that this is the only reason he's mentioning him in the very next sentence. But it's important to keep in mind that we're going to hear from the accountant about kind of the most important character in this story, other than Marlow himself. Let's continue. Moreover, I respected the fellow. So this is also why we're hearing about him. Yes, I respected his collars, his vast cuffs, his brushed head. His appearance was certainly that of a hairdresser's dummy. But in the great demoralization of the land, he kept up his appearance. That's backbone. His starched collars and got-up shirt fronts were achievements of character. He had been out nearly 3 years, and later on, I could not help asking him how he managed to sport such linen. So he's so impressed by his his put-togetherness, his professionalism in the midst of all this so-called savagery. And he asks years later how this guy managed to keep up his appearance. He had just the faintest blush and said modestly, "I've been teaching one of the native women about the station." Now let me ask you what these next 3 words probably mean. It was difficult. She had a distaste for the work. Thus this man had verily accomplished something, and he was devoted to his books, which were in apple pie order. Everything else in the station was in a muddle: heads, things, buildings, caravans, strings of dusty, with splay feet arrived and departed, a stream of manufactured goods, rubbishy cottons, beads, and brass wire set off into the depths of darkness. And in return, at last we get the reason for all of this rapacious and pitiless folly. Why is it happening? In return for all the goods that leave into the Congo came a precious trickle of ivory. I had to wait in the station for 10 days, an eternity. I lived in a tent in the yard, but to be out of the chaos, I would sometimes go get into the accountant's office. It was built of horizontal planks and so badly put together that, as he bent over his high desk, he was barred from neck to heels with narrow strips of sunlight. There was no need to open the big shutter to see. It was hot there, too. Big flies buzzed fiendishly and did not sting, but stabbed. I sat generally on the floor, while, of faultless appearance, and even slightly scented, perching on a high stool, he, the accountant, wrote. He wrote. Sometimes he stood up for exercise. When a truckle bed with a sick man, some invalided agent from up country, was hurriedly put in there, he exhibited a gentle annoyance. "The groans of this sick person," he said, "distract my attention. And without that, it is extremely difficult to guard against clerical errors in this climate." So what we've just heard is an example of bureaucratic psychopathy. This accountant, who has strangely kind of bewitched Marlow with his starched collar and his nice looks, which we can confidently assume are the result of bullying a native African woman into keeping his clothes nice. When another white man is brought in, an agent from the company, and he's sitting in the accountant's office, because it's one of the few places that's inside that is a room, and he's dying. This man who's worked for the company is sitting there dying. The accountant is bothered by it because it distracts him from his work. "One day," he remarked, without lifting his head, "in the interior you will no doubt meet Mr. Kurtz." There it is. There's the most important character we've been waiting to hear about. On my asking who Mr. Kurtz was, he said he was a first-class agent, and seeing my disappointment at this information, he added slowly, laying down his pen, "He is a very remarkable person." Further questions elicited from him that Mr. Kurtz was at present in charge of a trading post, a very important one, in the true ivory country. At the very bottom of there, this is now the accountant talking, sends in as much ivory as all the others put together. He began to write again. The sick man was too ill to groan. The flies buzzed in a great pace. And so it makes you wonder, if Mr. Kurtz is such a prodigy, such a top performer, in this context of rapacious and pitiless folly, in order to extract a precious trickle of ivory, what does it mean to be a top performer in that context? Suddenly, there was a growing murmur of voices and a great tramping of feet. A caravan had come in. A violent babble of uncouth sounds burst out on the other side of the planks. All the carriers were speaking together, and in the midst of the uproar the lamentable voice of the chief agent was heard, giving it up, tearfully for the 20th time that day. He rose slowly. "What a frightful row," he said. He crossed the room gently to look at the sick man, and returning, said to me, "He does not hear." "What? Dead?" I asked, startled. "No, not yet," he answered with great composure. Then, alluding with a toss of the head to the tumult in the station yard, "When one has got to make correct entries, one comes to hate these savages, hate them to death." So, again, the accountant is bothered by sort of the sounds of what's happening as a result of this colonizing work, interrupting his accounting work. He remained thoughtful for a moment. "When you see Mr. Kurtz," he went on, "tell him from me that everything here," he glanced at the desk, "is very satisfactory." Can you imagine saying that? "I don't like to write him. With those messengers of ours, you never know who may get a hold of your letter at that central station." That's where Marlow's going next. He stared at me for a moment with his mild, bulging eyes. "Oh, he will go far, very far," he began again. "He will be a somebody in the administration before long. They above, the council in Europe, you know, mean him to be." So he's saying the C-suite, the executives, what he calls they above, the council in Europe. The accountant is convinced that they will make Mr. Kurtz, a leader within the company, and not just in Africa, but kind of from the boardroom in Europe. He turned to his work. The noise outside had ceased, and presently, in going out, I stopped at the door. In the steady buzz of flies, the homeward-bound agent was lying flushed and insensible. So the guy who was dying in the accountant's office was lying flushed and insensible. The other, bent over his books, was making correct entries of perfectly correct transactions. And 50 feet below the doorstep I could see the still treetops of the Grove of Death, where he saw those dying men that he called black shapes. Next day I left that station at last with a caravan of 60 men for a 200-mile tramp. We did it. We made it to the end of part 2. If you've watched this whole time, thank you. Thanks for staying along for this this journey. Shoosha. She's just completely asleep, not moving an inch. Well, again, thanks for watching. Next time we'll give a recap of part 2. We'll go into part 3. And I guess the thought that I want to leave you with is, why do you think this text stays with us? Like, why do you think we keep rereading this novel? And I'll give you my answer, which is that we keep seeing what Marlow describes in the part 1 video that we read, reading that we did, colonization. We keep seeing that, where the strong nations kind of supplant the governments of the weaker nations and do what they want to with them. And we see what that looks like. And we also all have to live within this brutal corporate world with corporate morality, where you get things like this. There's a man dying. A man who worked for the company is lying flushed and insensible. The other, the accountant, bent over his books, was making correct entries of perfectly correct transactions. So even despite death of this white agent who's there next to the accountant, and despite the death happening in what Marlow calls the Grove of Death, where he had come from, here's the accountant making perfectly correct transactions. And so all of us who read Heart of Darkness when it first came out, or read it today, have to somehow try to survive in this corporate world where, what matters is the transactions, and are they correct? And thankfully, most of us don't have to work in an environment that's half as brutal as what Marlow's seeing here in the Congo, but that same basic morality, or lack of it, is something that I think almost all of us have to deal with every day. But I'm curious what you have to think, so I hope you'll let me know in the comments below, and we'll be back again soon for part 3. Thanks for watching.